Hello everyone and welcome to the tavern. Today we had a fairly decent episode of X-Men, but the big thing that occurred with this episode is that it introduced some plot points that made me go, that's what they're going to do. That's what our 3-part finale is. Okay, let's see how you handle this. Unfortunately, those things would be spoilers for not just this episode, but the next couple of episodes. So I'm put into the strange position where I want to discuss what's coming up, more so than what actually happened in this episode. It is one of those things that tends to happen when source material gets adapted, and since X-Men 97 has done a more or less good job with adapting source material, I am quite excited to see what happens next. However, before we can talk about that next week, we need to talk about this week's episode. It's a very plot-heavy episode, so there will be some spoilers in my review, but I'll try to keep things as vague as possible. We open our episode with Gambit's funeral. It's a really well-done scene, with Kurt being the officiant. One of the reasons why a funeral scene can be really effective in visual media is not because of the character that died, and how much we liked that character, but it's more about how the other characters react to the death. Seeing the X-Men just broken up over the death of Gambit, hearing Nightcrawler's speech, those kind of things can really hit you emotionally. This is a really strong opening to this episode, and while I don't think the rest of the episode hits the emotional depth this opening hits, I feel that Gambit's funeral was incredibly well handled. One of the things that's noted by Jubilee at the funeral, of course, is that Rogue is not there. Why? Because she's out smashing stuff, dealing with her grief in a more destructive manner. This also leads Rogue into running into a couple cameos, which I have some mixed feelings about, but it's nice seeing Rogue kick some ass. Meanwhile, we have the rest of the X-Men dealing with the ruins of Genosha and the world's apparent apathy towards the situation, because everyone's afraid a mutant-human war is going to start. At the same time, we cut away from the main story to have Jubilee and Sunspot talk to Sunspot's mother about his powers. I'm sure this is building into Sunspot finally joining the team, but for now, it feels like a ham-fisted way of telling a coming-out story. We end our episode with a raid on Madripoor, where the X-Men take on a unexpected villain. They put an Omega Sentinel into X-Men 97. Heck yeah, I love the Omega Sentinel concept. If you haven't seen this episode, I do recommend watching it just for this ending battle, where the Omega Sentinel essentially wrecks the X-Men like they are just a bunch of beginners. This fight does lead into a Deus Ex Machina moment with Cable, but Cable showed up, and that in and of itself is pretty cool, because he's been teased throughout this season, and we finally get to see him do something, and we know he's going to be involved in the final arc of this season. Our primary theme is grief, and it's fairly well handled. We get to see Rogue grieving in her own way by unleashing her anger until she finally has a talk with Nightcrawler. We get to see the X-Men being completely broken up by the death of Gambit, and we see how the various X-Men deal with the ruins of Genosha, which is all handled in a very mature fashion, and each character's reaction makes sense for the character. Our second theme is not quite as good. There is a large discussion around Genosha that ties into mutant acceptance, and it is handled with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the foot. It isn't really well done. For all the maturity you see in the writing of grief, you see immaturity in the writing of mutant acceptance. It almost feels like a 12-year-old who's really angsty wrote those moments, rather than an actual adult trying to tell a mature and thought-provoking episode of the X-Men. It is so weird I have to actually talk about a children's cartoon as a thought-provoking show. But considering the mature themes that have appeared in other episodes, I feel that's fair. Sadly, our characters are a little bit shallow here as well. It is nice to see Rogue really show some intense emotions throughout the episode, but her intense emotions are smash things, yell at people, threaten people, and cry a little bit. It's not bad, it just feels very shallow, and we could have gotten more into the depth of how Rogue deals with grief, rather than just seeing her act out and then cry, and then act out some more. We get to see Cyclops and his frustrations of being a leader, of wanting to keep Xavier's dream alive, while also really starting to understand where Magneto was coming from in his view of humanity. In addition to that, we get a nice little moment where Cable is revealed to be Nathan Christopher Summers, which is a nice little moment, but I wish we could have had more time with Scott and Nathan before jumping to the end of our episode. Even though it is just a brief appearance, Emma Frost actually gets her diamond skin, which is really cool. And for those who aren't super familiar with the comics, after getting her diamond skin, she basically joins the X-Men. So while I'm not expecting Emma Frost to be a member of the team in the remainder of this season, I wouldn't be surprised if she joins the team or is an on-again, off-again member in the next season. Plus, she got to say something snarky, and this gives me the excuse to show this Emma Frost picture again. So, win-win. The audio is decent as usual, but I do have a few minor gripes. Gyrick listens to classical music, that's perfectly fine. I do feel his choices are cliched, but I guess for a villainous character it's okay. It just feels very cartoony. The one thing I didn't like, however, is the usage of the song Flying Purple People Eater, because it is so freaking cringe in this episode that otherwise has a lot of heavy emotional themes. I understand why it was chosen. Please don't explain to me in the comments why it was chosen. I understand. That being said, just because I understand doesn't mean I have to like it. Cable's voice is pretty good, has that kind of older, grizzled edge to it that you really want for Cable. I can't really judge his actor just yet because he hasn't said enough or done enough for me to really discuss that, but I am looking forward to hearing more Cable in later episodes. One of the things I haven't talked about yet when it comes to the visuals is that the title sequence changes when the roster of characters changes. I really like this. I think this is one of the things that shows that effort was really being put into the show, because they could have just made one title sequence and moved on with life, but instead they did alter the sequence to work with the changes to the team. This also means that the team doesn't have to stay stagnant, and we can swap characters out or change characters up when necessary, and have an opening sequence that reflects that new version of the team. Overall, the action in the episode is pretty good, especially that Omega Sentinel fight scene that I talked about earlier. Another thing they did really well in this episode is the use of shading to hide the faces of certain characters and to make our villains look a little more villainous. But it also worked for Cable, especially to emphasize his glowing eye, and to make him just look that much more badass as he skulks in the shadows after saving the X-Men. As I said in the story sequence, we do have some cameos. We have General Ross, which I think might be his first appearance in the X-Men animated series, and Captain America, who did appear in a previous episode of the X-Men animated series. I'm fine with these, though they do kind of feel like they're there just for the sake of being like, hey, we have rights to these characters, rather than actually serving a major purpose. But if these two characters actually do something in the following arc, then I'm perfectly fine with it. But for now, I'm not going to celebrate cameos for the sake of cameos. Also, it seems to be implied that Rogue is stronger than the Hulk when she goes after General Ross. And, no. Rogue is not stronger than the Hulk. No one is stronger than the Hulk. Hulk is strongest there is. All this means is either General Ross was overconfident that his facility was capable of withstanding the Hulk, or the writers just thought it would be cool to see Rogue smash through the roof of a bunker, and didn't think of the implications towards what this would mean for the Hulk. Either way, that implication still bothers me. I do want to talk about the Omega Sentinel just a little bit. I think they gave it a really creepy look, they made it a real threat, and I do appreciate that. Finally, as I love to just bring up children's television standards, there is a murder and an attempted murder. So, yeah, that ain't flying. But again, this is a more mature version of the show, but I still like bringing this fact up because I find it fun. As I said in the introduction, there's enough hints as to what the arc they're going to be covering in the finale is, and I'm excited to see how this plays out. I'm curious how close it'll be to the comics versus how many changes they will make to the overall story. Either way, the 3-part story shouldn't disappoint, hopefully. A weird thing occurred to me after the episode is that we never saw anyone mourning for Magneto. Sure, he was a villain for a long time, so obviously the X-Men probably not going to be too broken up about that. However, if Magneto is still alive, then he might be going through the recharge and rebuilding of his body storyline that would eventually lead into Fatal Attractions, which was a huge X-Men moment from the early 90s, and a story arc I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to cover in the next season of X-Men. assuming this series gets a second season. It took me a while to think about what score would really work for this episode, and after going over my rubric a couple times, I've settled on a 3.5. It's not a bad episode, there's a lot of really good things here, but there's nothing that blew me away. The characterizations are fine, but there are no real standout moments. In addition to that, while I do like how the grief theme was handled, the mutant acceptance theme is kind of cringy in terms of some of that dialogue. Flying Purple People Eater, but there are some good things about this episode. The action, Cable showing up, the hints for the next arc, interpersonal drama without it being any kind of love triangle or running in place storytelling. I have high expectations for the next episode, and if you know what the next arc is going to be like I do, let me know how excited you are about that storyline in the comments. Until next time, thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, and share this episode with all your friends who love the X-Men. Until next time, I'll see you at the tavern.